Welcome to Thueringer Farming Simulator 2015. We continue in the Desert of Wheat by Zane Grey. Sure you can't, but you'll have to organize something. Up here in this desert, you could have a heap of trouble if that outfit got here strong enough. You'd better tell every farmer you can trust about this IWW. I've only one American neighbor, and he lives 6 miles from here, replied Dorn. Olson over there is a Swede and not a naturalized citizen, but I believe he's for the U.S., and there's Dad, interrupted the girl. I believe our driver is listening to your very uninteresting conversation. She spoke demurely, with laughter in her low voice. It made Dorn dare to look at her, and he met a blue blaze that was instantly averted. Anderson growled, evidently some very hard names under his breath. His look just then was full of characteristic Western spirit. Then he got up. Lenore, I reckon your talk, it'll be more interesting than mine, he said dryly. I'll go see Dorn and get this business over. I'd rather go with you, hurriedly replied Kurt, and then, as though realizing a seeming discourtesy in his words, his face flamed, and he stammered, I don't mean that. But Father is in a bad mood. We just quarreled. I told you about the war. And Mr. Anderson, I'm a little afraid he'll... Well, son, I'm not afraid, interrupted the rancher. I'll beard the old lion in his den. You talk to Lenore. Please don't speak of the war, said Kurt appealingly. Not a word, unless he starts roaring at Uncle Sam, declared Anderson, with a twinkle in his eyes, and turned toward the house. He'll roar all right, said Kurt, almost with a groan. He knew what an ordeal awaited the rancher, and he hated the fact that it could not be avoided. Then Kurt was confused, astounded, infuriated with himself over a situation he had not brought about and could scarcely realize. He became conscious of pride and shame and something as black as hopeless as despair. Haven't I seen you before? Asked the girl. The query surprised and thrilled Kurt out of his self-centered thought. I don't know, have you? Where? He answered, facing her. It was a relief to find that she still averted her face. At Berkeley, at California. The first time and the second at Spokane in front of the Davenport, she replied. First and second? You remembered both times, he burst out incredulously. Yes, I don't see how I could have helped remembering. Her laugh was low, musical, a little hurried, yet cool. Dorn was not familiar with girls. He had worked hard all his life there among these desert hills, and during the few years his father had allowed him for education. He knew wheat, but nothing of the eternal feminine. So it was impossible for him to grasp that this girl was not wholly at her ease. Her words and the cool little laugh suddenly brought home to Kurt the immeasurable distance between him and a daughter of one of the richest ranchers in Washington. You mean I was impertinent, he began, struggling between shame and pride. I stared at you. Oh, I must have been rude. But, Miss Anderson, I didn't mean to be. I didn't think you saw me at all. I don't know what made me do that. It never happened before. I beg your pardon. A subtle, indefinable change, perceptible to Dorn, even in his confused state, came over the girl. I did not say you were impertinent, she returned. I remembered seeing you. Notice me, that is all. Self-possessed, aloof, and kind, Miss Anderson now became an impenetrable mystery to Dorn. But that only accentuated the distance she had intimated lay between them. Her kindness strung him to recover his composure. Stung him to recover his composure. He wished she had not been kind. What a singular chance that had brought her here to his home, the daughter of a man who came to demand a long unpaid debt. What a dispelling of the vague thing that had been only a dream. Dorn gazed away across the yellowing hills to the dim blue of the mountains where rolled the Oregon. Despite the color, it was gray, like his future. I heard you tell Father you had studied wheat, said the girl, presently, evidently trying to make conversation. Yes, all my life, replied Kurt. My study has mostly been under my father. Look at my hands. He held out big, strong hands, scarred and knotted, with horny with horny palms uppermost, and he laughed. I can be proud of them, Miss Anderson. But I had a splendid year in California at the university, and I graduated from the Washington State Agricultural College. You love wheat, the raising of it, I mean, she inquired. It must be that I do, though I never had such a thought. Wheat is so wonderful, no one can guess who does not know it. The clean, plump grain, the sowing on fallow ground, the long wait, the first tender green, and the change day by day to the deep waving fields of gold. Then the harvest, hot, noisy, smoky, full of dust and chaff, and the great combine harvesters with 34 horses. Oh, I guess I do love it all. I worked in a Spokane flour mill too, just to learn how flour is made. There is nothing in the world so white, so clean, so pure as flour, made from the wheat of these hills. Next you'll be telling me that you can bake bread, she rejoined, and her laugh was low and sweet. Her eyes shone with soft blue gleams. Indeed I can. I bake all the bread we use, he said stoutly. And I flatter myself I can beat any girl you know. You can beat mine, I'm sure. Before I went to college, I did pretty well. But I learned too much there. Now my mother and sisters and brother Jim, all the family except Dad, make fun of my bread. You have a brother. How old is he? One brother, Jim, we call him. He is past 21. She faltered at the last few words. Kurt felt on common ground with her then. The sudden break in her voice, the change in her face, the shadowing of the blue eyes, these were eloquent. Oh, it's horrible. This need of war, she exclaimed. Yes, he replied simply, but maybe your brother will not be called. Called? Why, he refused to wait for the draft. He went and enlisted. Dad patted him on the back. If anything happens to him, it'll kill my mother. Jim is her idol. It'd break my heart. Oh, I hate the very name of Germans. My father is German, said Kurt. He's been 50 years in America, 18 years here on this farm. He always hated England. Now he's bitter against America. I can see a side you can't see. But I don't blame you for what you said. Forgive me, I can't conceive of meaning that against anyone who's lived here so long. Oh, it must be hard for you. I'll let my father think I'm forced to join the army, but I'm going to fight against his people. We are a house divided against itself. Oh, what a pity. The girl sighed, and her eyes were dark with brooding sorrow. A step sounded behind them. Mr. Anderson appeared, sombrero off, mopping a very red face. His eyes gleamed with angry glints, his mouth and chin were working. He flopped down with a great explosive breath. Kurt, Your old man is a son of a son of a gun, he exclaimed, vociferously, manifestly. Liberation of speech was a relief. The young man nodded seriously and knowingly. I hope, sir, he did. You just bet your life. He called me a lot in German, but I know cuss words when I hear them. I tried to reason with him, told him I wanted my money, was here to help him get that money off the farm, some way or other, and he swore I was a capitalist, an enemy to labor and the Northwest, that I and my kind had caused the war. Kurt gazed gravely into the disturbed face of the rancher. Miss Anderson had wide open eyes of wonder. Sure, I could have stood all that, went on Anderson, fuming, but he ordered me out of the house. I got mad and wouldn't go. Then, by George, he pulled my nose and called me a bloody Englishman. Kurt groaned in the disgrace of the moment. But amazingly, Miss Anderson burst into a silvery peal of laughter. Oh, Dad, that's just too good for anything. You met your match at last. You know, you always boasted of your drop of English blood, and you're sensitive about your big nose. He must be over 70, growled Anderson, as if seeking for some excuse to palliate his restraint. I'm mad, but it was funny. The working of his face finally set in the huge wrinkles of a laugh. Young Dorn struggled to repress his own mirth, but unguardedly he happened to meet the dancing blue eyes of the girl, merry, provocative, full of youth and fun, and that was too much for him. He laughed with them. The joke's on me, said Anderson, and I can take one. Now, young man, I think I gathered from your amiable dad, if the crop of wheat was full, I'd get my money. Otherwise, I would take over the land. For my part, I'd never do that, but the others interested might do it, even for the little money involved. I tried to buy them out so I'd have the whole mortgage. They would not sell. Mr. Anderson, you're a square man, and I'll do, declared Kurt. Come out and show me the wheat, interrupted Anderson. Lenore, do you want to go with us? I do, replied the daughter, and she took up her hat to put it on. Kurt led them through the yard and past the old barn to the edge of the open slope where the wheat stretched away down and up as far as the eye could see. Chapter 2. We've got over 1,600 acres in fallow ground, a half section in rye, another half in wheat, turkey red, and this section you see, 640 acres, is in blue stems, said Kurt. Anderson's keen eyes swept from near at hand to far away, down the gentle, billowy slope and up the far hillside. The wheat was 2 feet high, beginning to be thick and heavy at the heads, as if struggling to burst. The fragrant, dry, weedy smell, mingled with dust, came on the soft summer breeze, and a faint silken rustle. The greenish, almost blue color near at hand gradually in the distance grew lighter and then yellow, and finally took on a tinge of gold. There was a living spirit in that vast wheat field. Dorn, it's the finest wheat I've ever seen, exclaimed Anderson, with the admiration of a farmer who aspired high. In fact, it's the only fine field of wheat I've seen since we left the foothills. How is that? Late spring and dry weather, replied Dorn. Most of the farmers' reports are poor. If we get rain over the Bend country, we'll have only an average yield this year. If we don't get rain, then flat failure. Miss Anderson of instant interest in the subject, and she wanted to know why this particular field, identical with all the others for miles around, should have a promise of a magnificent crop when the others had no promise at all. This section lay fallow a long time, replied Dorn. Snow lasted here on this north slope quite a while. My father used a method of soil cultivation intended to conserve moisture. The seed, wheat, was especially selected, and if we have rain during the next 10 days, this section of blue stem will yield 50 bushels in the acre. 50 bushels, ejaculated Anderson. Blue stem. Why do you call it that when it's green and yellow? Queried the girl. It's a name. There are many varieties of wheat. Blue stem is best here in the desert country because it resists drought. It produces large yield, it does not break, and the flour mills are rated very high. Blue stem is not good in wet soils. Anderson tramped along the edge of the field, peering down here and there, pulling a shaft of wheat and examining it. The girl gazed with dreamy eyes across the undulating sea, and Dorn watched her. We have a ranch, thousands of acres, but not like this, she said. What's the difference? Asked Dorn. She appeared pensive and in doubt. I hardly know. What would you call this scene? Why, I call it the desert of wheat, but no one else does, he replied. I named Father's ranch Many Waters. I think those names tell the difference. Isn't my desert beautiful? No. It has a sameness, a monotony that would drive me mad. It looks as if the whole world had gone to wheat. It makes me think, oppresses me. All this means that we live by wheat alone. These bare hills, they're too open to wind and sun and snow. They look like the toil of ages. Miss Anderson, there is such a thing as a love for the earth, the bare brown earth. You know we came from dust, and to dust we return. These fields are human to my father, and they have come to speak to me a language I don't understand yet. But I mean, what you see, the growing wheat here, the field of clouds over them, the wind and the dust and glare and heat, the eternal sameness of the open space, these are the things around which my life has centered. And when I go away from them, I am not content. Anderson came back to the young couple, carrying some heads of wheat in his hand. Smut, he exclaimed, showing both diseased and healthy specimens of wheat. Had to hunt hard to find that. Smut is the bane of all wheat growers. I never saw so little of it as there. In fact, we know scarcely nothing about smut or its cure, if there is any. You farmers who raise only grain here have got the work down to a science. This blue stem is not bearded wheat like turkey red. Has that beard anything to do with the smut? I think not. The parasite or fungus lives inside the wheat. Never heard that before. No wonder smut is the worst trouble for wheat raisers in the Northwest. I fields literally full of smut, and we never are rid of it. One farmer has one idea and someone else another. What could be of greater importance to a farmer? We're at war. The men who claim to know say the wheat will win the war, and we lose millions of bushels from this smut. That's to say, it's a terrible fact to face. I'd like to get your ideas. Dorn, happening to glance again at Miss Anderson, an act that seemed to be growing habitual, read curiosity and interest, and something more in her direct blue eyes. The circumstance embarrassed him, though it tugged at the floodgates of his knowledge. He could talk about wheat, and he did like to, yet here was a girl who might be surprised to be boxed, who might be supposed to be boxed. Still, she did not appear to be. That warm glance was not politeness. Yes, I'd like to hear every word you can say about wheat, she said with an encouraging little nod. Sure she would, added Anderson with an affectionate hand on her shoulder. She's a farmer's daughter. She'll be a farmer's wife. He laughed at this last sally. The girl blushed. Dorn smiled and shook his head doubtfully. I imagine that good fortune will never befall a farmer, he said. Well, if it should, she replied, ardent. Well, if it should, she replied archly, just consider how I might surprise him with my knowledge of wheat. Indeed, Mr. Dorn, I am interested. I've never been in the bend before in your desert of wheat. I never before felt the greatness of loving the soil or caring for it, of growing things from seed. Yet the Bible teaches it, and I read my Bible. Please tell us. The more you say, the more I'll like it. Dorn was not proof against this eloquence, and he quoted two of his authorities, Heald and Woolman, of the State Agricultural Experiment Station, where he had studied for 2 years. Bunt, or stinking smut, is caused by two different species of microscopic fungi which live as parasites in the wheat plant. Both are essentially similar in their effects and their life history. Teletia triticai, or the rough-spored variety, is the common stinking smut of the Pacific regions, while the Teletia factans, or the smooth-spored species, is the one generally found in the eastern United States. The smut berries or balls from an infected head cover millions of minute bodies, the spores or seeds of the smut fungus. These reproduce the smut in somewhat the same way that a true seed develops in a new plant. A single smut ball of average size contains a sufficient number of spores to give one for each grain of wheat in 5 or 6 bushels. It takes 8 smut spores to equal the diameter of a human hair. Normal wheat grains from an infected field may have so many spores lodged on their surface as to give them a dark color. But other grains, which show no difference in color to the naked eye, may still contain a sufficient number of spores to produce a smutty crop if seed treatment is not practiced. When living smut spores are introduced into the soil with the seed wheat, or exist in the soil in which smut-free wheat is sown, a certain percentage of the wheat plants are likely to become infected. The smut spore germinates and produces first a stage of the smut plant in the soil. The first stage never infects a young seedling direct, but gives rise to secondary spores or sporida, from which infection threads may arise and penetrate the shoot of a young seedling and reach the growing point. Here the fungus threads keep pace with the growth of the plant and reach maturity at or slightly before harvest time. Since this disease is caused by an internal parasite, it is natural to expect certain responses to its presence. It should be noted first that the smut fungus is living at the expense of its host plant, the wheat, and its effect on the host may be summarized as follows. The consumption of food, the destruction of food, and the sporulating process, and the stimulating or retarding effect on normal physiological processes. Badly smutted plants remain in many cases undersized and produce fewer and smaller heads. In the fife and blue stem varieties, the infected heads previous to maturity exhibit a darker green color and remain green longer than the normal heads. In some varieties, the infected heads stand erect when normal ones begin to droop as a result of the increasing weight of the ripening grain. A crop may become infected with smut in a number of different ways. Smut was originally introduced with the seed, and many farmers are still planting it every season with their seed wheat. Wheat taken from a smutty crop will have countless numbers of loose spores adhering to the grains, also a certain number of unbroken smut balls. These are always a source of danger, even when the seed is treated with fungicides before sowing. There are also chances for the infection of a crop if absolutely smut-free seed is employed. First, soil infection from a previous smutty crop. Second, soil infection from wind-blown spores. Experiments have shown that separated spores from crushed smut balls lose their effective power in from 2 to 3 months, provided the soil is moist and loose, and in no case do they survive a winter. It does not seem probable that wheat smut will be controlled by any single practice, but rather by the combined use of various methods: crop rotation, the use of clean seed, seed treatment with fungicide, cultural practices in breeding and selection of varieties. Failure to practice crop rotation is undoubtedly one of the main explanations for the general prevalence of smut in the wheat fields of eastern Washington. Even with an intervening summer fallow, the smut from a previous crop may be a source of infection. Experience shows that a fall stubble crop is less liable to smut infection than a crop following summer fallow. The apparent explanation for this condition is the fact that the summer fallow becomes infected with wind-blown spores, while in a stubble crop, the wind-blown spores, as well as those originating from the previous crop, are buried in plowing. If clean seed or properly treated seed had been used by all farmers, we should never have had a smut problem. High percents of smut indicate either soil infection or imperfect treatment. The principle of the chemical treatment is to use a poison which will kill the superficial spores of the smut and not materially injure the germinating power of the seed. The hot water treatment is only recommended when one of the chemical steeps is not effective. Certain cultural practices are beneficial in reducing the amount of smut in all cases, while the value of others depends to some extent upon the source of the smut spores. The factors which always influence the amount of smut are the temperature of the soil during the germinating period, the amount of soil moisture, and the depth of seeding. Where seed-borne spores are the only sources of infection, attention to the three factors mentioned will give the only cultural practices for reducing the amount of smut. Early seeding has been practiced by various farmers, and they report a marked reduction in smut. The replowing of the summer fallow after the first fall rains is generally effective in reducing the amount of smut. Very late planting, that is, 4 or 5 weeks after the first good fall rains, is also an effective practice. Fall tillage of summer fallow other than plowing seems to be beneficial. No smut-immune varieties of wheat are known, but the standard varieties show varying degrees of resistance. Spring wheat generally suffer less from smut than winter varieties. This is not due to any superior resistance, but rather to the fact that they escape infection. If only spring wheats were grown, our smut problem would largely disappear. But a return to this practice is not suggested, since the winter wheats are much more desirable. It seems probable that the conditions which prevail during the growing season may have considerable influence on the percent of smut in any given variety. When Dorn finished his discourse to receive the thanks of his listeners, they walked back through the yard toward the road. Mr. Anderson, who led the way, halted rather abruptly. What are those men talking to my driver? Who are those men talking to my driver? Dorn then saw a couple of strangers standing near the motor car, engaged in apparently close conversation with the chauffeur. Upon the moment they glanced up to see Mr. Anderson approaching, they rather hurriedly departed. Dorn had noted a good many strangers lately, men whose garb was not that of farmers, whose faces seemed foreign, whose actions were suspicious. "I'll bet 100 they're IWWs," declared Anderson. "Take my hunch, Dorn." The strangers passed on down the road without looking back. "Wonder where they'll sleep tonight," muttered Dorn. Anderson rather sharply asked his driver what the two men wanted, and the reply he got was that they were inquiring about work. "Did they speak English?" went on the rancher. "Well, enough to make themselves understood," replied the driver. Dorn did not get a good impression from the shifty eyes and the air of taciturnity of Mr. Anderson's man, and it was evident that the blunt rancher restrained himself. He helped his daughter into the car and then put on his long coat. Next, he shook hands with Dorn. "Young man, I've enjoyed meeting you, and sure have profited from the same," he said, "which makes up for your dad. I'll run over here again to see you around harvest time, and I'll be wishing for that rain." "Thank you. If it does rain, I'll be happy to see you," replied Dorn with a smile. "Well, if it doesn't rain, I won't come. I'll put it off another year and cuss them other fellows into holding off too. You're very kind. I don't know how we'd ever repay you in that case." "Don't mention it. Say, how far did you say it was to Palmer? We'll have lunch there." "It's 15 miles that way," answered Dorn. "If it wasn't for Father, I'd like you to stay and break some of my bread." Dorn was looking at the girl as he spoke. Her steady gaze had been on him ever since she entered the car, and in the shade of her hat and the veil she was adjusting, her eyes seemed very dark and sweet and thoughtful. She brightly nodded her thanks as she held the veil aside with both hands. "I wish you luck. Goodbye," she said, and closed the veil. Still, Dorn could see her eyes through it, and now they were sweeter, more mysterious, more provocative of haunting thoughts. It flashed over him with dread certainty that he had fallen in love with her. The shock struck him mute. He had no reply for the rancher's hearty farewell. Then the car lurched away and dust rose in a cloud.